Welcome everybody to our annual Curtius lecture, which happens very early this year, and we are very happy that we could convince Laurie Paul to join us from Yale in her break now over the winter time. So welcome Laurie for the Curtius lecture. We already, at least some of us, had the pleasure of hearing her speak on complicated epistemology issues with respect to other parts of her work, most specifically computation and LLMs. So let me briefly introduce her a little bit longer than earlier for the lunch talk, though I won't give you a full profile, though again it would be very interesting to just delve deep into Paul interpretation here. But Laurie is Millstone Family Professor of Philosophy and Professor of Cognitive Science at Yale University since 2021. Before moving to Yale, she has made all the relevant, up to the highest distinctions, career steps at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Meanwhile, she has held many other distinguished positions. She was a professorial fellow, among other things, at the RK Philosophical Research Center at our partner university, the University of St. Andrews, was one of our partner universities here. She got her PhD at Princeton University back in the days, supervised, I think, by David Lewis, if I'm not wrong, and this has shaped her earlier work in a way where she has made a name for herself working on technical issues mostly in mereology and causation. Also her first book, quite influential, deals with causation, a user's guide. Then her work in metaphysics and philosophy of mind and epistemology led her to the discovery of types of things we're going to discuss today, a certain type of paradox at the heart of decision theory. And she published in 2014, very influentially, the book Transformative Experience with Oxford University Press. And she is now working on an extension of the project, and hopefully soon out will be replacing yourself under contract with Farrar, Straus and Giroux. And she has widely published in core areas of theoretical philosophy. I mentioned causation, issues of the self, but also bordering on the practical in a way, and we'll discuss this. Her recent work, not only at Yale, but before, given that she's coming from philosophy of science too, has always been interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. Laurie has been publishing quite significantly also with colleagues not only from neuroscience and psychology, but from computational areas. We discussed some of this earlier. And I had the pleasure of spending some intensive intellectual time with her in Kyoto recently, which was an opportunity to convince her to join us today and give the Curtius lecture, among other things. So welcome, Laurie. It's a pleasure and honor to have you with us, and I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation that we started now on the dimensions of your work dealing with transformative experience and such. So welcome again to Bonn, and looking forward to your thoughts.
So thanks very much for having me. It's such a pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to the conversation. What I'm going to present today is a blend of the work that I've done on elucidating the concept of transformative experience, but also a development of it. I am in the close to finishing a second book that is developing basically some of the ideas that I'll talk about today, but it is really also an extension of previous work. Okay. Consider a blind man who is about to have retina surgery to become sighted. Imagine him the night before, lying in bed, thinking about the operation, trying to imagine how his life is about to change. He knows, of course, that if the operation is successful, he'll gain something like ordinary vision, but also that in the future, the nature of his life, of his lived experience, will be vastly different. And while he's presumably heard plenty of discussion from friends and family about what it's like to see color, watch movies or cross a busy street unaided. He probably also has lots of information from his doctor, right? In a very basic sense, he has absolutely no idea what his future life is going to be like. Okay? And more generally, it's true to him, it's true for all of us. We can see how the nature and character of his life is about to change dramatically upon gaining this new sense modality. And he knows that it's about to change, but in a very, I think, epistemically important sense, he doesn't know how it will change. Try as he might, he cannot imaginatively project himself forward into his future, okay, in order to represent in an accurate way what it will be like to be sighted. He simply can't imaginatively capture or simulate salient features about what it's going to be like for him as that future self living as a person with ordinary vision. And the way that I think about this is that the blind man faces an epistemic wall, okay? And this epistemic wall is created by the transformative nature of the experiences involved in becoming sighted, especially if you've grown up blind, okay? And this wall blocks him from understanding from the inside, basically, from his internal point of view, from his first-person point of view, what his life will be like. And the only way that he can know what his life is going to be like is to actually have the experience. That is, he will need to have the operation and experience vision for himself, okay? So today, what I'm going to talk about are life-changing experiences like this, with this kind of structure. Right? Experiences that shape who you are and what you care about, but also experiences that you have to have in order to kind of, in an important sense, know what's coming. These kinds of experiences, transformative experiences, include things like going from being blind to sighted, but also include experiences like going to war and fighting in a battle for the first time, having your first child. Right? They can also include experiences like trying psychedelics or having a religious epiphany. They can also include experiences like becoming quadriplegic after a terrible accident or experiencing catastrophic memory loss. These experiences, all of them, right, would change you. And in changing you, they restructure the nature and meaning of your life, how you think of yourself, as well as the lives of others around you. Now, what I'm going to do is explore the main components of the concept of transformative experience, right? How we should think about these experiences. And I want to show how exploring this conceptual structure and thinking about some of the practical applications can help us to understand, I think, the very special and distinctive ways that these new experiences can form and change us. And interestingly, I think that this relates to a number of other topics, any of which I'd be happy to talk about or give you kind of a rundown of in the discussion if you're interested. But here I'll focus on really just on transformative experience. So to get started, I want to set out some of the main constituents, some of the main ideas of how I'm thinking about this. So the first idea, right, to get us going, is that crucially, certain kinds of experiences can be necessary for knowledge. Now, to get a grip on this idea, I want to consider a famous thought experiment in philosophy involving a pretend case of a woman named Mary who grows up in a black and white room. Now, the original version of this thought experiment comes from Frank Jackson, and in his version, and if you've seen, either you might know the thought experiment, or maybe there have been films and plays actually made about it. There was this one film, Ex Machina, involved the concept, where a woman grows up in a black and white environment, and then has the opportunity to kind of to leave her black and white space and see color. Now, in the original thought experiment, Frank Jackson is making an argument about physicalism. Okay, what he's trying to do there is argue that even if you had access to all the physical truths of the world, you still might not have access to the phenomenal truths of the world. That's not how I'm using this experiment. Okay, in the original thought experiment, the thought is that Mary knows all the science that we'll ever know about the brain and about color and about the world, and still she doesn't know what it's like to see red before she leaves her black and white room. But I'm not worried about physicalism here. So my thought experiment is about ordinary Mary. A Mary who knows all the current science, let's say, has all the testimony from her friends and relatives and everything else about what it's like to see color, but has never seen color herself. She grew up in a black and white space. And the question here is, when or if she left her black and white room, and saw like a fire engine or a red apple or something like that, would she discover something new? And I think absolutely yes, she would. She would discover what it's like to see red. Okay, so that means, right, that for Mary to know what it's like to see red, she actually has to leave her black and white space and go out and experience red. So she has to actually see red in order to know what it's like. Okay, so that first idea, that first important idea, is that for some kinds of experiences, we have to actually have them to know what they're like. Like seeing red for the first time, right? Or tasting something new that's very different from what you've had before. Sometimes you have to have an experience, if it's a new kind of experience, in order to know it. Now, I define these kinds of experiences as epistemically transformative, and I'm using epistemically to highlight that it's about knowledge, right? And the idea here is that an epistemically transformative experience is an experience that you have to have in order to know what it's like, and that it teaches you something. And in particular, the new experience that you have teach you both what that experience is like, and as a result, it gives you new abilities. It gives you the ability to imagine other experiences like it, right? It might give you the ability, under certain circumstances, to recognize red when you saw it for a second time under certain contexts. It allows you to kind of imagine and cognitively model possibilities and assign values to future experiences that you haven't already had. And this means then experience can teach us something distinctive that we can't discover in any other way, and then will give us new abilities that we couldn't get in any other way. Now, this element of epistemic transformation plays a role in a famous story, a story called Flatland. This is an a short English novel. I'm not sure how familiar European audiences are with it, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. The story describes an agent who has lived all of his life in a two-dimensional reality, Flatland, right? And in this two-dimensional world, everyone who lives in this world, when they perceive shapes, they perceive them only as lines, right? Because they're only in two dimensions. So when they see a circle, for example, or a sphere, or a circle, or whatever, the only way that they can detect it is by moving around it, because they can't go up or down, because it's only a two-dimensional space. So that means when they see a circle, it looks like a line. How do they know it's a circle? Because however they move around it, the line doesn't change its length. Compare that to when they see a square. When you see a square, and if you can only move in two dimensions around it, right? Well, as you move, the line that you see will get longer and shorter, depending on whether you're viewing the square on the angle, so then you'll see its diagonal, it'll look like you'll be the length of its diagonal, or if you just see it from the side, and then it's just like from the side. Is everybody with me? It's like intuitively, just have to think about how you might model this being in this two-dimensional space. Okay, so in the story of Flatland, the main character and everyone around him has always lived in a two-dimensional space, and then suddenly, somehow magically, he's thrust into a three-dimensional space. Now he can see circles and squares from above and below. Okay, and this, like, as we used to say back in my day, it rocks his wah. I don't know if anyone says that anymore. None of you probably say that because you're not with you. Anyway, it's a big deal, right? And the crucial point is that his concept of shape is now transformed, because now he knows how to represent shapes in 3 dimensions. And the point is by having this new experience, he discovers this new way to think about shapes, right, in 3 dimensions as opposed to just 2. And in the story, there's a lot of drama, because what happens is eventually the agent is returned to his 2-dimensional world. And he runs around and tries to tell all of his friends about what happened, and nobody believes him. Nobody understands what he's talking about, right? So he's utterly alienist. He has an existential crisis, and rightly so. Okay, so the story of Flatland, that's the story. That's the part that's important for what I'm doing. But it's also relevant that the novel sort of didn't get much attention when it was first published, but then Einstein published his theory of relativity, okay? And as all of you know, the innovation was to introduce a concept of velocity as relativistic as opposed to absolute. And also to think then of time as a 4th dimension, right? So there were 4 dimensions that were relevant, not just 3. And in this kind of context, the Flatland novel was rediscovered, and it was hailed like widely as a beautiful illustration of the type of conceptual change that was needed for people to understand and appreciate Einstein's contribution, to think of time as the fourth dimension. Okay, so it's a great story. I highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It's really kind of beautiful. This is what that's the classical cover, A Romance of Many Dimensions. There's also some very nice politics in it, because women are not respected in various ways, and anyway, and they should be, and obviously, and so anyway, I advise you to read it. Okay, now my colleagues and I, Joan Ochako, Isaac Davis, and Jillian Jarrah Ettinger, took the Flatland case and used it to explore a computational formulation of the learning involved in this distinctive kind of cognitive change, this epistemic transformation, right, that the agent undergoes. I can tell you more about it, but basically what we did, we built little agential models exploring different spaces, and we were able to show that what happens when an agent left its two-dimensional space and discovered a three-dimensional space was that its concept was transformed, right, in the sense that its script for action and behavior got overwritten and replaced. So the point is, instead of merely expanding content to what the agent already knew, one concept, the concept of two-dimensionality, was replaced by a concept of three-dimensionality. So put intuitively, the agent's concept of shape, the one that the agent that went into three-dimensional space, which was originally understood in two-dimensional terms, right, in terms of these lines that expand and contract, was replaced by a concept of shape as three-dimensional, right? You go up and down, so it was a completely different way of experiencing shapes. What seems to have happened is the two-dimensional concept got shunted into like some kind of edge case. Okay, so the third main idea in transformative experience then is to say that epistemic transformation isn't just a mere change, it's a special kind of change, okay? It's a change that involves adding a new concept, okay, not just some kind of little augmentation or modification, right? And maybe even replacing one's old concepts with some new concepts. So there's replacement, or maybe there's an additional new concept. There are different ways in which this can happen. So those are the three main elements of the epistemic side of things. But there's also another thing that's important, and that is, it's actually very important, that there are personally significant types of epistemic transformation. Okay, so in other words, there's what I'm going to describe as personally transformative experience. So return to the blindness case to see how this works. In that example, the congenitally blind man has a retina operation and then discovers a new way to live, right? He discovers what it's like to have ordinary vision. And this discovery is obviously, as I've just described it, epistemically transformative. But it's more than that, okay? The epistemic transformation doesn't just change what he knows about the world. He isn't just discovering a new dimension, right? He's discovering a whole new way of being in the world. And to get a sense of how radical this change is, I want to read to you a description from a blind person about how they're experiencing a landscape. I opened the front door, and rain was falling. I stood for a few minutes, lost in the beauty of it. Rain has a way of bringing out the contours of everything. It throws a colored blanket over previously invisible things. Instead of an intermittent and thus fragmented world, the steadily falling rain creates continuity of acoustic experience. I hear the rain pattering on the roof above me, dripping down the walls to my left and right, splashing from the drain pipe at ground level on my left, while further over to the left there's a lighter patch as the rain falls almost inaudibly upon a large leafy shrub. On the right it is drumming with a deeper, steadier sound upon the lawn. I can even make out the contours of the lawn, which rises to the right in a little hill. The sound of the rain is different and shapes out the curvature for me. The whole scene is much more differentiated than I've been able to describe, because everywhere are little breaks in the patterns, obstructions, projections, where some slight interruption or difference of texture or of echo gives an additional detail or dimension to the scene. So this is a description of how someone sees acoustically. Okay? Later, the narrator describes how he can detect that a light has been turned on over his head, because he's able to detect the very slight increase of warmth in the layer of air across the bridge of his nose. Now, just this little snippet, there's lots more. If you read the memoirs, you read discussions by people who live in the world as a blind person, you will find lots of really interesting discussion and testimony about how life with basically with audition as your dominant sense modality is lived, and how different it is from those of us with vision as our dominant sense modality. I should also note that there are huge differences in the brains of people who grew up blind versus people who grew up sighted. That's because the auditory cortex is in a different part from the sensory, from the vision cortex, and so and basically your dominant sense modality determines where a lot of activity is happening in your brain, where neural connections grow and stuff like that. So basically people's brains develop differently depending on what their dominant sense modality is, and that changes in lots of subtle ways the way that their representations of the world happen. Okay. So the point is that if you have a different dominant sense modality, you have a very different way of perceiving and interpreting the world from someone whose dominant sense modality is vision, right? So coming back to the example, when the blind man becomes sighted, he's going to have a massive epistemic transformation. Not only will he perceive and represent the world differently as he learns to use visual input, right? But he's going to discover new things about the world. So obviously he's going to navigate the world visually, right? Here are some important things people talk about. They'll see the face of their spouse for the first time. Imagine seeing the face of your wife or your husband for the first time. You see the faces of your children for the first time. You see your own face for the first time. You have social interactions where you can actually, you can interact with people and see expressions on their faces and body language changes and things like that, right? So these are very, very important things that we take for granted as people who have ordinary vision, but that really come out as new kinds of experiences for somebody who's newly sighted. You can enjoy art in a different way. You can travel differently. You can play different sports. And also, I think relatedly to all of this, his sense of agency will change dramatically, right? How he understands himself as an agent interacting with others, how he represents himself. Okay, all of these changes will bring changes in how he understands himself, right? And in what he cares about. And in that sense, they will bring personal transformation. So a personal transformation, as I define it, then happens when something central, something really kind of embedded in the way that you understand yourself or the world changes, okay? So it happens when there's a conceptual change, maybe a replacement or a new concept comes in and brings about or a change or replacement in some of your core preferences, some of the things that you care about most, maybe some of the people that you care about most. This change in values and preferences changes who you are as a person in the sense of changing maybe your practical identity. Maybe it changes, the category that you put yourself under, what you take to define some of your integrity, how you interact with other people, maybe some of your most important sorts of, cares and choices. Okay, so just to get a sense of how profound conceptual change can be, I like to look at a very obvious example, and the obvious example that's one of that I prefer is the Copernican revolution, because it's straightforward and easy for everybody to get. Okay, so in antiquity, right, it was thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, and this makes sense, right, because you see the sun rise in the east and it seems to travel across the sky and sink in the west. There were all kinds of religious reasons and cultural reasons for everyone to think, well, absolutely, we're at the center of the universe, man. We're where it's at, right? And Copernicus's idea that, no, this was all a mistake, and actually the Earth revolves around the sun, was huge, right? It revolutionized not only our scientific picture of the world, but also our cultural way of thinking of ourselves, basically both in religious terms and also cultural terms about well, maybe we weren't the center of everything after all, right? This is very threatening to many people. And in brief, it replaced our old understanding of the Earth as being at the center of the universe, right? And indirectly, this implicit assumption that human civilization was at the center of the universe, with a view that, well, actually, maybe we're a little more peripheral, and turns out the sun is the center of everything. That was the new idea. Okay. Now, the important point here is that the Copernican revolution was not just a scientific revolution, but it was a conceptual revolution, just like I was talking about earlier with AI earlier today, right? And this conceptual revolution had enormous cultural impact. Okay, so it transformed the way that we thought of ourselves as of human society. about humanity and its role in the cosmos, and all kinds of like iterative implications. And what I'm really saying is I take the relationship between epistemic transformation in a person and personal transformation to be analogous, okay? So the thought is, look, a personal transformation is a kind of personal conceptual revolution, right? It's a revolution in how you understand yourself, a revolution in how you understand who you are and what you care about most. And in this case, then, your epistemically transformative experience overwrites some of your core personal values, right? Not all of them, but some of them. Or overwrites something basic about how you make conceptual sense of the world and everyone around you. And in this sense, it brings about a personally transformative experience. And that changes who you are, the kind of person that you are. It replaces yourself, as I would say. So this idea, right, is to say that a transformative experience is a combination of epistemically and personally transformative experience. And I think of it as a Copernican revolution writ small. It's like a revolution of one. Okay? Okay. So that's the basic kind of concept. And now I want to talk about some of the ways that it changes how we think about ourselves. I think a really interesting thing about transformative experiences concerns how they affect us as agents, and in particular, how the way they affect the way that we understand ourselves as making choices and undertaking projects as we live our lives forward. Michael Bratman, a philosopher at Stanford, has described really quite influentially in various contexts how, as a practically rational agent, a person's acting and planning can be understood in terms of one's self-governance over time. The idea is that as agents, kind of who we are in important ways, involves governing ourselves through time by projecting our thoughts and actions forward and planning in accordance with how we evolve ourselves through the present and into the future. And then also the thought is like in terms of this kind of creative, constructive, agentic activity, we kind of understand ourselves as kind of human and having control over our lives. It's kind of Kierkegaardian, I would say. Okay. Now, to self-govern in this way, right, to think of ourselves like projecting ourselves forward and managing our future and making choices for ourselves, we rely on our ability to simulate and predict. And we take ourselves to be rationally evolving ourselves forward in a temporally directed way, right, with local control, at least partial local control, over our immediate futures. And the trouble is that in cases of transformation, our ability to look forward in order to plan and act is blocked by an epistemic wall. In other words, our ability to rationally evolve ourselves forward, either even imaginatively or actually, right, in an eligible way, and thus to see ourselves as agents with local control over ourselves is blocked. And we can see it with the example of the blind man, right? I described the transformative change that he's going to undergo as the replacement of his old way of representing himself, primarily with audition, with a new sighted way of representing himself in his world, right? But because he faces replacement of his way of representing himself in the world, he faces, when he tries to think about it, a kind of incomprehensible future. Okay, there's a kind of conceptual incoherence with the way that he thinks about himself in the world now and this new way that he's supposed to think about himself when he's trying to think about himself as living in the world as sighted. And this is true even though he has all this testimony and this other information from family and friends that tell him about what he should expect, right? He can know all the things that they say and have all that testimony, and yet from within, he lacks a certain ability. Okay. So, and you should think about like the inability to think about 3 dimensions instead of just 2, right? Okay. So, I think this kind of problem, this kind of conceptual incoherence, can actually be related to another famous philosophical thought experiment. This, also from the philosophy of mind, and this thought experiment comes from Thomas Nagel. And Nagel asks us to say, well, look, what is it like to be a bat? And he says, you can't possibly know what it's like to be a bat, right? He argues, basically, that our minds are so different from bat minds that we just don't have the ability to imagine what it's like to be a bat. At least not accurately. You can imagine something, but it isn't gonna be right. Okay. Now you might think the Nagel example, and sometimes it's used this way in classes, is illustrating more or less the same idea as the black and white Mary example, right? Bringing out a point about how we need experience to find out what something is like. And that is part of, I'll get some tea. That is part of the Nagel thought. But there's something really additional to Nagel's thought experiment that I think is that's very important, okay? So I'm going to read the quote. So Nagel says, I want to know what it's like for a bat to be a bat. Yet if I try to imagine this, I'm restricted to the resources of my own mind. And those resources are inadequate to the task. Even if I could, by gradual degrees, be transformed into a bat, that makes me so happy, that transformed, like it's like 1986 or something. Nothing in my present constitution enables me to imagine what the experience of such a future stage of myself, thus metamorphosized, would be like. Okay? Metamorphosed is what he said. Okay, so the Nagel point, right, is that there's a kind of conceptual impossibility involved in a human being trying to imagine what it's like for a bat to be a bat. It's not about like imagining, sure, I can imagine what it's like for a human being to be a bat. Nagel talks about it. Like I can imagine hanging upside down and kind of flapping wings, or whatever, but that's a human imagining what it's like to be a bat, not a human being imagining what it's like for a bat to be a bat. That's the thing that's not possible, right? And this is precisely the problem that the blind man has, okay? There's something about what it's like to be sighted that the blind man cannot know, right? So it's not possible for him to know what it's like for a sighted person to experience being sighted. There's just something about who he's going to become tied to what his future will be like that is unintelligible to him now. In other words, to be able to know what it's like to be sighted, he has to change the kind of mind that he has. Okay. And the larger point is that anyone who finds themselves facing transformative self-change faces this kind of inconceivability, right? There's a sense in which it's just not even possible for a person to understand who it is that they will become when they face a transformative change of mind. They just lack the conceptual resources. So I think there are interesting existential implications then of transformative change. And in particular from the point of view, from the first person point of view, of the person who's about to undergo that change. And I think these implications are philosophically distinctive, but I think they can also be practically salient. So consider another kind of transformation, one that is a little bit more common, okay? Getting dementia due to Alzheimer's. A person who faces this kind of transformative change faces an incomprehensible future. Imagine you were suddenly diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. They face a kind of subjective impossibility in understanding what will happen to them over time, who they will become, when they're going to undergo this kind of transformation in who they are, in their self. And to see this intuitively, I just want to take us through a little bit of an example. So consider this loss of ability to form short-term memories. Let's think of somebody maybe not, just like someone who just loses their ability to form short-term memories. There are other cognitive changes that come with Alzheimer's, but let's just take one. This is characteristic of people who have this disease, right? When you lose your short-term memory, there's something really basic that you lose. And what you lose is a capacity for explanation. Let's think about it this way. So imagine you're about to make espresso in your kitchen, and the Bialetti pieces are spread out along the counter, and there's some coffee there, right? And as you stand there, you suddenly lose your memory of what you were about to do, right? And think about it this way. If I walked into the kitchen and said, well, what are you doing? You would lack an explanation. You wouldn't know, oh, am I cleaning up after having some coffee? Am I looking for a piece of Bialetti to hit you with to get you out of my kitchen, right? Am I going to have coffee? You don't know the answer. You do not have an explanation for why you're standing there in the middle of the kitchen with the Bialetti pieces in front of you. You can construct something, and this is what you see people with Alzheimer's do, is they construct explanations. Sometimes they're better than others, right? I mean, they have to draw on all kinds of things, and often this is part of the stress and strain that we have in interacting with people with Alzheimer's. It doesn't just mean losing explanation. It also means a certain kind of loss of evidence and a corresponding loss of trust. Trust comes from evidence, right? Memory is evidence, or gives you evidence. Why do you trust someone? Because you know how they've acted in the past, right? Mutual trust involves not only me knowing what you've done in the past, you know what I've done, what I've been doing in the past, and each of us knows that the other knows it. Okay, so there's this important kind of mental relationship that we have that depends very, very deeply on each of us having memory, and that's what's undermined again when someone loses their memory. And so as a result, people with Alzheimer's often lose their intimate relationships. They lose their trust of people even they're close to. They have all kinds of paranoia issues. Combined then with a loss of explanation and a narrative for what someone's doing and why. Okay? So I think you can see, even just losing the capacity to form reliable short-term memories is incredibly destructive, incredibly destabilizing, and really changes one's sense of self and agency. Okay. And just to get a sense of this visually, what you have here is these are paintings done by an artist who was diagnosed with Alzheimer's, and they're self-portraits. And what he decided he was going to do was just paint his self-portrait every year, basically, or every 2 years, I think it was. And this is the one he started with. He painted himself there. This is his best representation of what he looks like. And then he painted this one, and then he painted this one, and this one shortly before he died. He's not being an abstract. He's not abstractly representing anything. He is painting his self-portrait. Okay, and what's so powerful about this is obviously it's like a representation of how one's own understanding of oneself can be destroyed.
Happens to be in Bonn, the artwork in our research center on neurodegenerative diseases.
Oh, is it? Oh, excellent. Okay, so well chosen.
Biggest one in Europe.
I love this painting. I was home with this series of paintings.
Just saw it live a couple of weeks ago.
Aha, excellent. Okay, so if you haven't seen it live, I recommend it. All right.
It's at NA.
So the larger point again is that for all of us, right, we face the possibility of this kind of destabilizing transformation. And some of us maybe face it more clearly than others, depending on our genetics. But it's not just about Alzheimer's, right? There are many other kinds of situations that can be destructive, not in just the same way, but in ways like this. So for example, maybe you find out that your spouse wants a divorce. Maybe you find out that you're about to become a parent. Maybe you're enlisting in the military and you realize you're going to have to go to war and fight on the front lines. Okay, and then all of us are facing the possibility of massive change given the AI revolution. So we're all facing transformation. In fact, I think we face it in all kinds of ways on a regular basis, whether we recognize it or not. And in each of these cases, if we try to get specific about the future self that we're going to inhabit, I think we face a certain type of incoherence, right, and a related loss of agency that's based in our inability to understand in a distinctive way who we're going to become. Okay. So I want to consider some implications of being in this situation, facing epistemic walls. Now, one of the implications, of course, involves the kind of existential ramifications of this. And I'm very interested in this, and I'm thinking and writing about this a lot. I think that, in particular, these questions relate to fundamental questions about how to understand ourselves over time, given the way that life involves transformation in the way that I say, often repeated transformations. Okay? And I do a good bit of work on temporal experience, and I think there's some really interesting questions there. But another implication concerns the issues that arise when we need to make important decisions involving these experiences. So, for example, maybe you're trying to decide whether to have a retinal operation if you're congenitally blind. Or maybe you're trying to decide whether you want to be a parent. Or maybe you're terribly lonely and you are trying to decide whether or not you want to take on an AI lover. I think that's transformative, okay? These choices are choices about whether to transform your life, and with it then to transform yourself, okay? And I think that there's a problem with this, and the problem is that the unintelligibility of the future self that you're choosing makes it impossible to choose in the ordinary way, where you evaluate and compare the values of your options, projecting yourself forward, and choose what you prefer, okay? Okay, so why? What is the problem here? Why does it affect your ability to choose in the ordinary, kind of straightforward, rational way that we want to? Well, to make a choice in an informed way, and certainly to make it rationally, you've got to be able to compare the values of your options. And the first problem, is that in this case, you don't know all the values that you need to compare. You can't ascribe values to all of your options in the way that you want to. To see how this works, go back to the case of Mary in her black and white room, right? If Mary doesn't know what it's like to see red, let's say she's given the opportunity to leave her room, but if she leaves, she can never come back. It's all she's ever known, right? Well, how is she supposed to decide whether or not she wants to leave her room if she can't actually tell you the value of what it's like to see color, what it's like to experience living in a world of color? If she doesn't know what it's like to see color, she doesn't know what values she should ascribe to the experience of permanently leaving her room and living out in the colored world when she's deciding whether she prefers to stay or whether she prefers to go. Now, there are other ways she can make the decision, but if what she cares about is, say, how happy she will be in having experiences of color, then she lacks the information that she needs to make the decision. And we can put this in a slightly different way. We can talk about her decision model. So what you have here is what's called a chess tree, okay? And the important thing about the chess tree is that it maps out, basically, as you start here, it maps out all of your options. So you might not be sure, might be uncertain about which option to take, but you know what all the options are and you know what the values are, okay? So chess trees are very useful because they're very precise ways of capturing a certain kind of uncertainty. But the problem that we have here is not a problem of uncertainty, okay? It's not that Mary is uncertain about the different values. Mary doesn't know the values. So she has a problem of unknowability, what's called an unknown unknown, or a known unknown. People vary on how they want to describe it, okay? So in other words, there are options out here for Mary that just aren't represented or representable in the decision tree. That's a really different kind of problem to have. So your model basically is incomplete, meaning that you've got a problem of values going undefined, meaning that your preferences will go undefined. And a problem like this comes up with any transformative choice, okay? So for another example, consider the choice of whether or not to become a parent.
No.
I always have such a good time choosing the photos for this one. Okay, any new parents in the room? Okay. Until you become a parent, you don't know what it's going to be like to be one, okay? There's lots of stuff that you know, but there's something quite distinctive that you don't know. So how are you supposed to compare if you're not sure, or maybe you're reluctant, to compare becoming a parent to remaining childless? My kids love it when I use this example, by the way, but they understand. So the problem is, like if you're trying to decide whether or not you want to become a parent, the issue is that because you're choosing or you're considering choosing something that's epistemically transformative, right? You're unable to determine some of the values of that outcome. And that means that your preference, technically speaking, has got to go undefined. Now you might think, oh no, I know what to do here. There's an easy fix for this problem. I'm just gonna ask my mom, okay? Or more generally, I'm gonna ask the experts, I'll ask my friends, I'll ask the psychologists how to assign values and how to and figure out what my preferences are. I am afraid that I don't think just relying on testimony is this easy. And it's not easy, well, there are a number of reasons, but there's one in particular that I'm going to talk about today. There's a second problem. Okay. To see the second problem, and this is going to take a little bit of discussion, so I'll go through it from a couple of different angles, right? But first, start by noting that rational choice, okay, as a presupposition, requires you to act in accordance with your current preferences. You are to choose in a way that maximizes your expected value, given your preferences at the time of the choice. So if I'm rational and I like chocolate ice cream over vanilla ice cream, then I choose the chocolate ice cream. Paradigm case of irrationality, if I choose the vanilla ice cream, then I prefer chocolate over vanilla. Any questions about that? Good. Okay, so keep that in mind. Now, the second problem then for transformative decision making is that if you choose to become a parent, the self that you will become is not the same self that you were when you made that choice. And this problem, by the way, is what's in the background of the conceptual incoherence that I talked about before when you try to imagine yourself in your future shoes, right? There's an incompatibility between the self making the decision and the transformed self, the self after the decision. So it's kind of like you're choosing to make yourself into a bat, right? Like into an alien self. And in fact, then, when you go and get testimony from parents about being, whether or not, about, what it's like for them to have a child and what their advice is for you about whether you should have a child, well, in some sense, all of them are bats. They've already been transformed. Okay, so the ways I think of them, they're all batty. Okay, and so, in other words, the information that you're getting now from these parents about the values of the different outcomes of having a child are not the values that you, or even they, would assign pre-transformation. It's not a pre-parent way of thinking about the world, right? So, for example, the value they assign to a life with less travel and less money, a lot less sleep, right, is not the same value that you, as a non-parent, would assign, everyone who has kids knows like this is true, to less money, less travel, and less sleep. The way you think about you and your world just changes. And this, the way to put this, right, is because the experience is personally transformative, right? You can only then get, if you're getting information from people who've had the experience, you can only get post hoc evidence about how the various outcomes rate as described by a post-choice individual. Okay? And the problem is that's not what you need. What you need is to know how to understand the outcomes given your current pre-parent preferences and ways of valuing these outcomes. Okay, remember, rational choice requires that you act in accordance with your current preferences, right? When you're choosing. So the second problem, is the way to put it is that the testimony that you can get will not give you the information that you need. Okay, so I said it once, now I'm going to say it again in a little bit of a different way because I think there's some subtlety here and it's important to kind of think about it from all the angles. So let's say you're deciding to become, whether you want to become a parent, okay? You're not sure, or maybe you're reluctant. If you're already sure you want to become one, you don't have to kind of worry about this, you just go ahead and do it. If you're not sure you want to do it, and since it's transformative, you find yourself facing the epistemic wall. Right? What is the life going to be like with my child? How are you to respond? So you respond by collecting up, because you're not sure what you want to do, get a bunch of testimony from parents. They all say it's fabulous, it changed my life, it's the most wonderful thing ever. We will all say that. Well, not everyone, but most of us will say that. Okay. The question is, what precisely is this parental testimony showing you, right? Well, what it's telling you is that formerly childless people think it's great to be a parent. And the trouble is, you might suspect that there's something about the experience of becoming a parent that makes you want to be one. Maybe something about becoming a parent changes someone in such a way so that now, as a parent, they love being this parent. But that's only because having that experience involves some kind of like psychological rewiring into loving being a parent when you become one. Maybe there are even good evolutionary reasons for this, okay? Maybe there's even a kind of Stockholm syndrome that some parents experience when they become a parent. Okay. One of my children is moving back in, and I'm thrilled, but that's definitely Stockholm syndrome. Okay. At the very least, you know that people's pre-parent preferences, for example, about how they want to have a career, about whom they love most, about how they want to spend their money, tend to change radically once they have a child, okay? And as a result, then, again, you face that problem. You cannot then rely straightforwardly on parental testimony to determine how you, as a non-parent, as a pre-parent, should think about your options now. So what's the technical source, the underlying technical source of this problem? The underlying issue is what is described as act-state independence. This is an axiom by Neumann and Morgenstern. It's a kind of axiom that's often relied on in at least on standard interpretations of expected utility theory. What is act-state independence? Well, the idea is that the state of the agent or the world should be independent in some sense of the act that's being performed. This is necessary for these models for evaluating changes, the positive or negative affective changes in the world. So act-state independence is violated in cases of transformation because the experience changes who a person is in virtue of having that experience, that chosen experience. And this changes the nature of the inference that we can make about their testimony concerning their satisfaction with the result. Okay? So here is one way to put it. I'm going to leave this slide up for a little while, but the point is the testimony doesn't distinguish between a utility value that represents what you now want for yourself and a utility value that represents what the psychologically alien self that will replace you then as a parent wants for itself. So that violates this fundamental precept of independence. So I'm going to just run through some very standard ways in which we rely on act-state independence so you can see the importance of this axiom. So imagine that you're in a context where you have an agent, and you're say you're in some kind of scientific context, and you want to find out if changing something in their environment makes them happier afterwards, okay? So you can change certain properties even if you don't change something deep about the state of the world. A standard approach is to take the agent, change this thing about their situation, and then test to see if they're happier or more satisfied with the change. Standard kind of causal modeling, counterfactual dependence testing, or testing, causal modeling. If the agent says they're more satisfied, you infer that changing their situation was the right thing to do. Lots of basic science works this way. So standard cases work very well with standard causal models. So as an example, if Finbar is more satisfied with his situation after he's been given chocolate ice cream than he was before he had his dessert, then we can infer that giving Finbar the chocolate ice cream satisfied his preference to have that particular dessert. This is, I think, fairly straightforward. It's an easy way to see the application. We use this kind of causal modeling to backwards infer what happened in some kind of case, but we also use it to make predictions. Okay? We want to use causal modeling to tell us about the future just as much as we want to use it to tell us about the past. If you're trying to predict whether you should make a change to an agent, such that the agent will be made happier by the change, then before actually changing their situation, because it's risky, if someone's happiness is at stake, you're going to model it. You're going to model it counterfactually. Okay? That is, so counterfactuals are fictional or contrary to fact scenarios, right? You counterfactually model the change and then counterfactually assess whether the agent is happier or more satisfied with the change. And if all goes well, then you endorse the change, okay? And this predictive use of causal models relies then on counterfactuals to determine truths about what would happen or what could happen or what could fail to happen if we perform certain actions. Okay, so imagine you're trying to do this for yourself. You're trying to make a decision, and you're going to use a causal model. You want to compare your options and make plans for your future, and so you're going to reason through various counterfactuals about yourself. Normally, this is unproblematic, as we can just use a version of the chocolate ice cream test, right? But instead of chocolate ice cream, let's talk about vacation, because it gets boring just talking about ice cream. Okay, so you might ask yourself, would I prefer to go camping in the Alps or visit museums in New York City? Tough choice, probably the Alps, but depends on the type of person that you are, I guess, in some sense. So to decide, you assess hypothetical possibilities in your future. Were you to go camping in the Alps, how satisfied would you be? How happy would you be? And were you to go to New York City and see museums, how satisfied or happy would you be? And you assess these hypothetical possibilities by imaginatively assessing each counterfactual. So you assess the fictional scenario, or I would say possible world, where you go camping, right, by imaginatively considering yourself camping, doing all the camping things that you're looking at the stars, building a campfire, having marshmallows, whatever. I don't know if you do that in the Alps, actually. Campfires might not be allowed, I don't know. And then you compare it to the fictional scenario of visiting the Whitney or the Met or something like that in New York, right? And then the thought is, well, look, you make these assessments and then make your decision depending on which activity gives you the most happiness, which one is the most satisfying when you make that comparison. Okay. So this is the crucial bit. your counterfactual assessment and comparison of yourself in these two different possible circumstances works because who you are stays the same. You stay constant in terms of what you prefer before and after you go camping, and you stay constant in terms of what you prefer before and after you go to the museum. Okay? So your act and your state are independent. This allows you to make a meaningful comparison between your before state and your after state to decide if you have become more satisfied, right? And also then allows you to have determinate preferences where you can choose the action that best fits your preferences, especially when you make the choice, right? But in transformative cases, as I've been saying, it just isn't this simple, right? Because by changing your situation, by choosing to transform, you are also reconfiguring what you prefer. That's the violation of act-state independence. And if so, it isn't at all clear that changing your situation is the right thing for you now, pre-transformation, given your current preferences. You just can't interpret the information in the same way. So put formally, when we can assume act-state independence, we know that the relevant facts about an agent stay the same from time 1 to time 2 as they evolve, independently of the act that they're performing. Maybe A's desires and values stay the same, and so you can see by tweaking something that, oh yeah, they're made happier, changing their situation was better for them, right? But when you have act-state dependence, you know then that the agent's act could change relevant facts about their value structure as they evolve from time T1 to time 2, right? Because the act that they choose to perform also revises their values in an endogenous or internal way. In such a case, by performing that act, A's values are rewired in response to this change. And so it isn't straightforwardly the case that even if they say they're happier after the change, that the change improved things. Now, let's think about becoming a parent. As a childless person, you might ask, would I prefer to have a baby? Or would I rather keep my life the way that it is? Following the strategy I outlined before of doing causal modeling and counterfactuals, you need to assess two counterfactuals. And the first counterfactual is, in a world where you remain childless, keeping your current life, how satisfied and happy would you be? And that the second counterfactual is, in a world where you become a parent, how satisfied or happy would you be? Assessing the first counterfactual, at least at a first look, seems pretty easy. You simply mentally project yourself just as you are into a fictional world where you remain childless and see how happy and satisfied you are with your life in such a scenario. And this is basically like a version of deciding whether you want it, like how happy you'd be when you went camping or something like that. Maybe actually taking a long trip where there was a lot of jet lag, because so you have to be a little bit tired. Okay. The second counterfactual, though, is, I think, fairly obviously not easy. Okay? You can't mentally project yourself just as you are into a counterfactual future where you are a parent, because you have to undergo transformation to become a parent. So you have to perform what causal modelers describe as an intervention. I love this term, it's definitely an intervention, on your internal mental states before you can even imagine how things might play out. Okay, well, what kind of intervention? Well, your imagined life as a parent needs to start by replacing your current representation of who you are with the new version of who you'll become, as defined by having a new set of values, your parental values. You're so then going to replace the way that you conceptualize yourself with a conflicting way of conceptualizing yourself, and then reason through, this is what you're supposed to do in this counterfactual, the way that this future version of yourself feels about your future life. Okay? And in effect, you have to imagine yourself as someone else. Should remind you of Bernard Williams, actually. And if you cannot accurately, imaginatively evolve this scenario forward, then you have no meaningful way of assessing this counterfactual for yourself, and thus no meaningful way of comparing the possibilities. Now, and that's the problem we have here. Now, I will note that even assessing, I think, the first counterfactual can involve a certain kind of paradox, because I think for many people, the possibility of remaining childless is probably just as transformative as assessing the possibility of becoming a parent, because they're worried about their preferences changing in unforeseen ways as they become old, and as their life evolves in surprising ways. So, they have to assess themselves under some kind of framework where they remain childless over their lifetime, especially towards the end of life, I think many people find this like a little bit incomprehensible, and especially if you've been, I won't talk about the drama of end of life. But the point is then, so some people may find themselves facing transformation whichever way they choose, just making the problem even harder. Okay, what if the solution to this problem you have of imagining this second counterfactual is going to be solved by just relying on the testimony of your friends and relatives or the doctor or whatever that you want to consult, or the psychological research. Okay, let's pretend the psychological research says, oh yeah, people who choose to have children are happier. It doesn't show that, but I'm a very happy parent, but it just doesn't show that. Okay, so that's the fact. Okay, well, I think at least anecdotally, even if the psychological research doesn't say this, lots of people individually will report that they're very happy that they had their child and that they're glad that they became parents, even if they weren't sure before, even if they were ambivalent, or even if they were a reluctant parent. Okay. But let's go back to the worry that I raised before. I think it's highly possible that it's the process of actually having that child that creates this value in the parent of valuing that child. If state independence is violated, then we can ask questions about what to infer from this testimony, right? So in a case, for example, where someone was actually a reluctant parent or was ambivalent about becoming a parent, and then they say later that they are happy, are we to infer that they had some kind of latent desire or disposition to become a parent that was somehow realized? They just weren't able to recognize it until it was realized? Or was that disposition implanted, created via the very experience of having the child? So think about it. When you have a kid, you end up wanting the kid that you actually ended up having, right? You don't want the kid that you would have had if you waited a month to get pregnant. But if you had waited a month, counterfactually, and had a different child, a counterfactual child, then counterfactually you would have wanted that counterfactual child, okay? Not the child you actually have now. So it does seem, I would say, intuitively, that there is something about the process of becoming the parent of a child that makes a person happy to have had that child. From the perspective, then, of the ambivalent or reluctant parent, this process can be, I think, can be regarded as evidence of preference replacement, or even, again, Stockholm syndrome, rather than the satisfaction of some latently existing disposition that you only discovered when the child arrived. Okay? So this means if we care then about informed choice, control over one's bodies, and etc., we can't just look to the testimony of the transformed to guide the choices of the untransformed. And that's the real point. Okay? This is a much more complex issue, I think, than I think has been recognized, at least, or has been sort of officially sort of recorded. Okay, so now you see how the problem arises for the transformative choice to become a parent. Maybe you can also see that it might arise for other kinds of cases, maybe in different directions. Okay, so very quickly, just consider a case where like a sudden accident occurs, like a sudden and severe accident occurs, or cases of dementia, again, like cases of Alzheimer's. Currently, advanced directives and other forward-looking approaches, along with the practice of informed consent, are in effect practices where we have our earlier self control and make choices for our later self. Okay? The problem is this self might be epistemically incommensurable with this later self, right? So who gives my earlier self the right to make these choices for my later self? Well, these rational action guidelines. But the problem is, I think it might be sort of obvious that these advanced planning strategies often result in all kinds of problems. They struggle with the kinds of self-change that transformation brings. I mean, in many cases, these advanced directives turn out to be utterly useless or actually really the wrong kind of plan altogether for the person who has really kind of changed quite radically, cognitively or physically. Okay. And really, my point with all of this is just that I think recognizing the complexity of what's going on here, the incomprehensibility we can have in terms of our relationships to different possible selves, and the problems basically with assuming that evidence and testimony can be interpreted straightforwardly in these contexts, should motivate us to rethink some of these practices to see whether they're accomplishing like what we want them to accomplish. And the point ultimately is to identify and explore a central and important kind of situation that I think all of us will find ourselves in at crucial points in our lives, points when we find ourselves faced with transformation, right? So, again, just to close, I sort of had two things I wanted to go through. The first part involved like the nature of transformative experience itself. I think I'm fascinated by the cognitive, computational, and epistemological elements of transformative experiences. Especially, I'm really interested in this concept of the epistemic wall and our desire to understand who we might become after radical change. But then the second part involved a discussion of the metaphysical and formal elements of transformation and transformative decision making, because I wanted to raise questions and show how these are linked to issues involved really with policy and formal causal and counterfactual dependence modeling. Because I think we need to understand these situations as presenting us with a really distinctive class of cases where ordinary generalizations just don't simply apply, and that part of the task is to find kind of palatable new solutions that can accommodate these distinctive features of transformative changes of self. Thank you.